Suzanne, thank you for that very generous introduction. I should tell all of you that I was once, some years ago, introduced by a young woman, and she said, Helena Kennedy, and to do this thing, she's a well-known lawyer who represents women and other criminals. And so many of you criminals here today. And actually, much more recently, I was on the tube after COVID and so on. I'm sitting there on the tube and people have masks on and things. And a woman was looking at me rather closely, and I had taken the mask off because I was about to have a sneeze. And then she says to me, "Are you who I think you are?" And I said, "Well, if you're thinking of killing your husband, I'm your woman." I have to tell you, everybody in the train turned around. They were all sort of like, if I'd had cards with me, I could have done a bit of business. Anyway, many of you, I mean, I've looked around the room and you're all so youthful. You're too young to remember, but in 1995, the United Nations held the 4th World Conference on Women, and it took place in Beijing. And it was a really big deal. And I remember being very cross at the time because I was in the middle of a big case and I couldn't get there, but you know, feminists from everywhere were going. And it was the famous event where Hillary Clinton said, "Women's rights are human rights." And you may all think, well, that's a pretty banal thing to say. It's speaking to the obvious to the world. But at the time, it wasn't. It really wasn't. The thing about talking about women specifically and tearing it out of that idea that, well, that's what happens in certain cultures and we do these things because of our relationships and, you know, and so on. And it's all very complicated. But nobody would talk about the business of women's lives having to be embraced in the whole human rights protections. And it was a real challenge to governments everywhere at the time. It was called the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, and it was adopted. And at that stage, it was the most progressive blueprint ever for advancing women's rights. And that platform for action, I mean, it's wonderful when you read it. It imagines a world where women and girls everywhere can exercise their freedoms and choices and realize all their rights, to live free from violence, to go to school, to participate in decisions in every platform and every table, and to earn equal pay for equal work. Well, we certainly haven't managed to achieve most of that yet. But there was a sort of political will unleashed, and we have seen a lot of change, and we mustn't pretend that there hasn't been some advances. The thing is that we have to call out the areas where there has been very little change, even in advanced democracies. But after that conference, people came back to their own countries full of hope. And so, you know, they started some heavy duty work, particularly at the United Nations. But the problem is that patriarchy and misogyny have very deep roots. And I know this because I've only recently finished a report that I've done for the Scottish Government. And it might be worth, if you have the time, to just look up the Scottish Government Misogyny Report, Helena Kennedy, because I had a panel, really great panel, and not just women, though fabulous women, but some guys on it too. And we were looking at the whole business of misogyny and its impact on women's lives, and the way from a very early age, women, and it's important for men to understand this, we're told by our mothers, you know, that we have a special, we need special protection in some way, that we have to be most guarded. We have to become risk assessors for our own safety. And we're told this, you mustn't go to the park on your own. You've got to always be with a friend. Make sure that you let me know where you are. Never come home late at night without somebody being with you. All of that stuff. And it feeds into women a sense that in some way we are responsible if something does go wrong. And so the whole business of that level of protection of the well-being of women is something that I'm afraid misogyny, which isn't about hating women, it's about a feeling of sort of entitlement in relation to women's bodies, but also a sort of a notion that there still should be a sort of primacy in our society of those of the male sex or gender. It was also a time when China, I mean, China used to have this wonderful expression that they used a lot. They seem to not use it very much anymore, but it came from Confucius, which was that women hold up half the sky. Well, I have to tell you that if you were doing the work that I'm doing just now on Muslim women, Uyghur women in Xinjiang province, where they are being persecuted simply because of being Muslim, where there are concentration camps, where women are experiencing forced sterilization. They're having their young children, but particularly their boys, taken away from them to be deracinated, to distance them from their own culture, their own religion, and so on, where they are people, men and women, are being imprisoned for really long periods of time simply for insisting upon protecting and living their lives in the way that relates to their identity. So it may have been Beijing that hosted this, but it certainly wasn't the place that somehow embodied most of these values. But the Beijing platform declared that the human rights of women included their rights to have control over their own bodies, to decide freely on matters related to their sexuality and their reproductive health and so on, free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. But it went further. It recognized that in order to lead a productive, fulfilling life, that you actually have to look at the fundamental issues of freedom and empowerment, and that human rights are the answer to a question of what do people need in order to thrive, physically, mentally, spiritually. And it was a question, of course, that Eleanor Roosevelt asked when she, after the Second World War, brought lawyers and jurists from around the world to create the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And at the time she was saying, can't we create world law to outlaw and make it impossible for terrible atrocities and terrible things to happen? And what she was guided on by laws and all that was that law is so rooted in the traditions and experiences of a society that it's very important to reflect that. Unfortunately, it was too clear that in imagining the human, what was being imagined was the male human, and the special experiences of women and women's needs were really not given any special consideration. The idea that we should be able to love and be loved by whoever we choose, to have freedom of thought, to have freedom of expression, protection from deliberately experiencing in pain, torture. All those things were, of course, in there, but without special reference to the way in which women can experience persecution in a particular and different way. The need to have things like a roof over one's head, to have food and water, an opportunity to learn and so on, to have healthcare. If you go to any society and you ask them, which are the human rights that matter most to you? I have to tell you that human rights, healthcare is up there in the top 3. So since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created in 1948, over the years, there have been efforts made to introduce conventions that are to protect women and girls. CEDAW, which was the convention to eliminate discrimination against women. Our country doesn't even send any woman to take part in that convention, that commission. There's a commission that is established, a standing commission, and at the moment we aren't sending anybody there. International law is of very little consequence to our current government, apparently. The Convention on the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Girls, again, a really important convention developed in the post-Universal Declaration years, because we as community societies started reckoning with the fact that women were still in secondary and second-class positions in most societies and inside most religions. And so if we look at the fundamental rights that there are, almost invariably, they connect to the business of women's health. The Office of the Human Rights Commissioner on Human Rights has reinforced the idea that statements of rights have to be invoked in relation to protecting women's health. The right to life. And the right to life, of course, doesn't mean automatically we start thinking about abortion. But in fact, that whole business of the right to life is very much a right that is, in many ways, balanced with the need to self-defense. We permit the taking of life in war, in conflict, and so on, when defending the nation or defending yourself individually. The idea that a woman should be able to request a termination when she is given information about her own well-being and her own health, and she knows her own body. The idea that somehow a brand new embryo of days gestation should take primacy over a life lived an adult woman, a woman who's become to the kind of maturity where she can actually reproduce and give birth, that life does not have greater value, seems to me something that we have to be really insisting upon. What's happening in the United States now should be teaching us lessons. The right to be free from torture. This seems very remote, and we imagine it in cells where people have electrodes attached to them or they're waterboarded. But in fact, the business of cruel and inhumane treatment, imagine forcing a woman to carry a baby that she does not want to give birth to, or she knows that she is going to be impoverished and her family might be impoverished because of it, or she knows that that child. I was in the United States recently for some work in Washington. And when I was there, I turned on the telly and there was a Black woman from Texas who was being forced to leave the state, but still under threat that she might be prosecuted because she was being refused a termination where it had been identified that the baby that she was carrying had no skull, that it had no covering for its brain at all, and that it would not survive after birth. That giving birth would then mean that the baby could not possibly survive. The medical world decided that, but abortion under the new Texas laws means that she could not, as of right, have an abortion, and was told that leaving, and everyone was fearful about it because of the new state of this, was fearful about traveling to another state for it in case she was prosecuted when she came back with her husband and to her little family. That, in my mind, is torture. To put women through that kind of thing is cruel and inhumane treatment. And I recently did a case which was involving a woman who was raped by a very powerful man in the course of her doing her work. She was in a country doing business, was invited to a meeting by this a minister, and was raped by him, was sexually assaulted by him in a grievous way. And we would say it was rape, but in other jurisdictions it might not have fitted their definitions. But she was held in his place, captive really, over a number of hours in terror of what would happen to her, because she didn't know how she was going to get away. That is cruel and inhumane treatment to be experienced by a woman doing her job of work, lured to a place, thinking she's going to a meeting, and then to be sexually assaulted in that way. Those definitions, so often in international law even, have not covered experiences that women have. And women have it in conflict, and they have it in situations that are not non-conflictual, one wouldn't think. Things like the right to education and to information, so important in being able to assert one's rights. The prohibition of discrimination. Fundamental to human rights is the idea that one person's human rights shouldn't be given primacy over somebody else's. There often have to be balances about collective rights as distinct from an individual's rights. The right to bear arms is held out in the United States as being such a vital thing. But of course, we know more and more children are being killed because of the availability of firearms. And yet there isn't a balancing out of those rights, because unlike here, where we've developed our rights law under the European Convention of Human Rights, we balance competing rights to find the best route to justice for those involved. There is a special rapporteur at the United Nations on health who really spends a lot of her time working on reproductive health. And it's interesting seeing the caseload and the casework that she does from around the world. The real issue around denial of access to services, the denial of women's lived experiences. And you'll hear from other people on this panel about the way in which, for example, women will be in circumstances where they're describing pain, where they're describing their own particular feelings that their body, something is wrong, and not being listened to. Because of course, there's always that's still around, the idea that women somehow are somewhat hysterical and that they overstate positions with regard to pain and so on. And I'll speak in a minute about the way that often is a particular experience from people from minority backgrounds of not being listened to, where their own lived experience is not taken sufficiently into account in the delivery of medical services. So we end up with poor quality services, often for women, subjecting women's access to services to third-party authorization. That somebody else will determine whether you're going to get the treatment that you really should and must have. Forced sterilization, forced virginity examinations. I mean, around the world, these things take place. And we've had them at different times in our history here, and not too long ago, in my lifetime as a lawyer. Forced abortion, forced pregnancies, people insisting on having male children and finding ways of securing that. The whole business of infant girls being more at risk. The business of female genital mutilation, and how that for so long, when I was a young lawyer, it being covered with the thing of it being a culturally observed tradition, and therefore it wasn't for people to claim that it was an abuse of human rights. It should be respected because it was particular peoples who had it. We had a case in my chambers, a case of Forna, where a young girl who'd managed to get here from Sierra Leone with her mother and stayed here during a period of conflict. And eventually when things had settled, her mother wanted to return. And the daughter, who was by that time 11 or 12, said, I don't want to go back because I do not want to go through what you went through as a little girl, where you had FGM, female genital mutilation, and your vagina, your clitoris was removed, your vagina was stitched up. I don't want that to happen to me. She'd been at school with other girls and knew that that was not what was a normal process to a female human body. And the case was taken because she wanted to remain and stay with her aunt. And it traveled all the way up through our courts. And even at the Court of Appeal, the two male judges said, no, 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 this is an accepted practice. And women in Sierra Leone accept this as a practice and so on. So it's not persecution. And it was the one woman on that court, Mary Arden, who did a sort of independent position, and then eventually went to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, Brenda Hale was by that time on that court and made the argument as to why this was a way in which women were experiencing cruel and inhumane treatment, because culturally, the culture was being determined a lot according to male norms, their expectations, preserving virginity in the interests of men, preserving the reproduction that was in the interests of men so that there couldn't be anybody else that might impregnate their women. And that's the whole purpose of female genital mutilation. And so child marriage, one of those things, again, is about keeping things, often about maintaining property interests, keeping things within a family, agreeing to marry because of it being appropriate for families to come together, often forgetting the risks associated with very proximate marriage. And again, I remember going out when I was chairing the British Council, going out to Saudi Arabia and being told by a doctor there who was a British trained doctor. And he said, you'll be a bit worried about what I do out here. And he said, because we were exploring the extent to which the genetic testing was disadvantaging women, girl children, and so on. And he said, no, no, no. He said, it's mainly about the fact that there is such proximate marriage, people marrying their cousins, marrying people who are very close in the family, that there's a lot of genetic carrying of risk with that, and health outcomes that are very bad for boys and girl babies. And as a result, we are doing high levels of selection of embryos beforehand and implanting them to make sure that, that people get the baby that they want without any of the propensities towards certain kinds of disease. And so, I mean, we have to recognize that some cultural practices create risks, and they create risks particularly for girl children, but they create risks for female mortality as well. Women largely are blamed for infertility, and patriarchy puts a value, as I've just said, on women's virginity and the ability to reproduce. And that creates a lot of suffering and mental problems for women often because of the pressure they feel under. Shining a light on hidden disease and female experience is really important. And we know that because of the recent exposure and women hearing about endometriosis, dismissed for years as being somehow nothing, not a problem that could be remedied, and that women were exaggerating the pain that they had in periods and so forth. And yet now there's a recognition of the toll it takes on women's lives. The whole issue of the menopause, buried and hidden, and women not allowed to raise it as a problem, for example, in the workplace. And I think that you'll hear from others about the issues concerning that. Women not able to express the ways in which there can be excessive pain during the period, the ways in which they suffer from symptoms that we all know about now, but which are not taken into account in the workplace often. The right of LGBTI women to healthcare. There are often real ways in which people from minority communities experience discrimination, and I include the LGBTI community in that. The whole scandal around the mesh implant, and you'll remember that, where women, after having a number of babies, often will have a urinary incontinence. And here they were being promised this remedy, which had never been properly tested, and the consequences of huge damage to women's health. Poverty and discrimination. I want to just mention and have it in as a thread in the course of your discussions today, the business of intersectionality. A lot of health problems impact more in a more damaging way on women who are poor, women who are disadvantaged financially. Those who are least well off in our society have more problems, health problems. There's higher levels of certain kinds of problem amongst those who are financially disadvantaged. But what is shocking is that if you look at what's happening in childbirth, there was an article recently, I think it might have been in The Guardian or The Independent, I can't remember where I saw it, but is childbirth more dangerous for Black women? And it was really looking at the experience and the statistics of how Black women are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth, that Asian women are 3 times more likely to die in childbirth than Caucasian women. And a lot of, there are ways in which you can read those statistics, which are about being disadvantaged in many different ways, also about propensities to particular kinds of diseases, which can have side effects which are exacerbated during pregnancy and possibly in the course of childbirth. But a lot of the time it's about not being believed about levels of pain. I want to then remind us of what happened during COVID, where undoubtedly more men died than women of COVID, but more women suffered the brunt of social and economic consequences of the pandemic. Domestic violence shot up, as you know, and the number of job losses were particularly high for women. Women were twice as likely to lose their job during lockdown. And of course, women earn less, they save less, they hold less secure jobs, which means that they haven't got the money to squirrel away. They're more likely to be employed in the informal sectors. The women who were basically cleaners and who got, cash in hand, then of course, as soon as COVID happened, they were shown the door and they were then without anything. And I'm afraid too many well-off families just said, sorry, Dora, and we won't need you for the next 3 months. And Dora had to somehow scrape together an existence in that period. And they weren't helped through it by many of the people who employed them. Women more often head one-parent households. Actually added to the real mental health problems for many, many women, trying to do the best by their children, trying to do homeschooling, trying to do it with little money and little technology and so on. And it really was hell for them. And so it does mean that women have less capacity to absorb economic shocks than men do because of the nature of women's work. Women stayed away from healthcare centres during that period. And of course, they weren't able, if they were experiencing domestic violence, to get the help that they needed. Girls out of school are more at risk than if they're going every day to school. And there are really concerning reports coming through about the impact and the rise in abuses of girls during that period. One of the shocking things is that for migrants, asylum seekers, a lot of my work is around these issues. And And doctors were being asked to police for migrants. I mean, basically to police migrants to see if they were legitimately in the country, to be asking certain questions about them as to whether they were entitled to healthcare and so on. And that, of course, in turn frightens people about going to doctors when they really need to be going to doctors. And so suffering can be increased. I just wanted to, it's an interesting thing. Here we are, almost invariably you hear talk about trying to yet again reduce migration, yet again limit the number of asylum seekers that come into our country, fleeing persecution. And yet, you know, the number of people in this country who are from minorities is so small. 86% of this country, well, certainly of England and Wales, is white. Let's remember that. My home city, Glasgow, is the largest dispersal city for asylum seekers. They take them in, whereas a lot of places just will not take in there. And now it's having to be made compulsory. There's 7.5% of our population in England and Wales is Asian, 2.2% mixed race, 3.3% Black. And so it's really interesting because people, if you were to ask the general public, they would get all those statistics madly wrong, exaggerating the number of people from minorities and exaggerating the numbers of asylum seekers they think could come in, and absolutely diminishing the numbers of people they think are from what they would say would be the white British population. We have seen since COVID a reversal of many of the gains that have been made for women. And that has been acknowledged by the Secretary General of the United Nations. And just look at what's happening in America around the issue of reproductive freedom, of abortion rights, and the ways in which that is being pulled back. If one isn't vigilant and careful, we can lose gains that have been made. So we can't be complacent. The shift in terms of abortion, for example, is happening in Poland. Again, a reduction of the access, increasingly called for. The part of the manifesto of the woman who's just become the Prime Minister in Italy has been to greatly reduce the access to abortion. So many of the issues that affect us as women, and that we as men and women in a society which we want to be fair and equal and just, where the rights of everyone are protected, we have to recognize the ways in which there are different experiences of healthcare for women, and that the rights of women have not been formulated adequately to give them the protection and the right in equality with men for proper healthcare. So that was how I wanted to start for all of you, just to say how important it is that we really examine outcomes, and that we also see the ways in which inequity in terms of financial position in society, inequity because of belonging to a minority, inequity because you came here fleeing a persecution, the ways in which that is experienced by people will affect their rights. And I'm afraid that we're facing a period where there's going to be a great deal of inequality, a great deal of suffering for our communities. And we have to make sure that the health of women is not further neglected because of all of that. Thank you.